Let's look at some quadratic equations. So we see a lot of quadratic equations here on the sheet. What makes it a quadratic equation? Well, when you see an x squared as the highest power, that means it's going to be a quadratic. And when you see the equals to sign, that means we have an equation. So once you have an x squared and an equals to sign, you'll generally have a quadratic equation. Now, this tutorial does not focus on how to factorize quadratic trinomials. So in order to understand this tutorial, you need to go back over the previous tutorials on how to factorize quadratic trinomials. I had 3 different methods that I showed you: the guide number method, the crisscross method, and the straight to the 2 brackets method. It's also important you look at the other factorizing tutorial on highest common factors and difference of 2 squares, because all of these techniques will be needed when we try to solve quadratic equations. So let's have a look at some examples of quadratic equations here and how we solve it. So I'm just going to pick a question. Let's say I pick question 5 here. 3x squared plus 7x plus 2 equals 0. 3x squared plus 7x plus 2 equals 0. Now, the first step to solve a quadratic equation is to factorize it. In this case, we have a trinomial. We have our x squared, our x, and our constant. We have our trinomial, and we're going to factorize it. I'm going to use the method where we go straight to the 2 brackets. So I've got my 3x and my x. Factors of 2 could be 2 and 1. I put the 2 here and the 1 here because, 3x by 2, that's 6x, 1 by x is 1x, and that will add to 7x as long as these are both pluses. So we now have the bracket 3x plus 1 times the bracket x plus 2 is equals to 0. So 3x plus 1 times x plus 2 is equals to 0. Now, the logic here, it's very important we understand it. So I like to ask my students, give me an example of 2 numbers that multiply to give you 0. And I'll get answers like, okay, if you multiply 0 by 3, you'll get 0. If you multiply 5 by 0, you'll get 0. So we already know that any number multiplied by 0 is 0. And most people are aware of that by this stage. So then I'll ask another question. Can you give me an example of 2 numbers that multiply to give you 0, but you cannot use 0 as either of the options? All right, so you cannot use 0 here or here. So can you give me an example of 2 numbers that multiply to give you 0 without using 0? So people will generally think about this for a minute, and there is no answer to this. So the point that I'm trying to make is that if 2 numbers multiply to give you 0, so if something by something else multiplies to give you 0, the only way that that's possible, as you can see, is if one of the values is 0. So either the first value has to be 0, or else the second value would have to be 0. So we use that logic to continue our next step here. So we have this bracket here, 3x plus 1, multiplied by this bracket here, x plus 2, equals 0. So if these 2 brackets multiply to give you 0, that could only be possible if one of the brackets was 0. So either the first bracket, either 3x plus 1 is equals to 0, or else the other bracket, x plus 2, it must be equals to 0. And once you do that, you create small little linear equations that you can actually solve. So I'll call this 3x equals minus 1. Then dividing both sides by 3, I will get x is equals to minus a third. And on the right hand side here, we get x is equals to minus 2. So I have 2 answers to this quadratic equation. Typically, quadratic equations, when you have an x squared, typically they have 2 answers. I'll go through another example here. 8x squared minus 2x minus 1 equals 0. Let's have a look at this one. So same idea again. We start off by factorizing the quadratic trinomial. So in this case, 4x and 2x I'm going to use, put a 1 here and a 1 here. This is going to be a minus 1, this is going to be a plus 1, because 4x by minus 1 minus 4x plus 1 by 2x will be a plus 2x. and that combines to add to the minus 2x that we need. Once again, if you're unfamiliar with that factorizing technique, check out the previous video on factorizing quadratic trinomials. So now we use the same logic as we previously used. We have this bracket multiplied by this bracket is 0. The only way the two brackets could multiply to give you 0 is either this bracket is 0 or else maybe this bracket is 0. So basically either 4x plus 1 is equals to 0 or 2x minus 1 is equals to 0. And then we just solve the linear equations that we're left with. In this case, 4x equals minus 1, dividing both sides by 4. X will equal minus 1 over 4. And on the right hand side here, 2x will equal 1, dividing both sides by 2. And x will equal a half. So solving quadratic equations so far has been fairly straightforward, as long as you are happy with factorizing the quadratic trinomial. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. Our typical quadratic equation takes the format ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the two equations we just did, the first one I did, 3x squared plus 7x plus 2 equals 0. Our a was 3, our b was 7, and our c was 2. And the second one, our a was 8, our b was minus 2, and our c was minus 1. So your typical quadratic trinomial, we call it a trinomial because it has three numbers, the a, the b, and the c. The number in front of the x squared, the number in front of the x, and then the number remaining at the end. So what happens if we have the case where our c value is 0? So a typical quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c. But what if c is 0? What I mean by that is, as you look at all these examples, we just have the x squared and the x. We just have the x squared and the x, the a and the b, but there's no c part. Now this is still technically a quadratic equation. These are all still technically quadratic equations because remember, to be a quadratic equation, we just have to have an x squared and an equals to sign. So all of these are still quadratic equations, but in order to solve these quadratic equations, since they're not trinomials, we will use the highest common factor method. For example, if I do the first one here, x squared plus 2x is equals to 0, I use the highest common factor. So my highest common factor in this case would be x bracket x plus 2 is equals to 0. And now we use the same logic as previously. If this x multiplied by this x plus 2 is 0, that is only possible if either x is 0 or else if x plus 2 is 0. And in this case, x is 0 is one solution, and my other solution will be x is equals to minus 2. One more example here. 5x squared minus 3x equals 0. This is still a quadratic equation, but we have no constant at the end. Our c value is 0. So, same again, when we just have the x squared and the x, we will use our highest common factor. In this case, our highest common factor is x once again. X bracket 5x minus 3 equals 0. So in this case, this means either x has to be 0 or else 5x minus 3 has to be 0. So x is 0 is one of our solutions. The other solution is going to come from here. 5x equals 3. Then dividing both sides by 5, you will get x is equals to 3 over 5. So one thing you guys will notice, in any of the situations where the c value is 0 or you don't have the number at the end, like in this example and this example, you will notice that x equals 0 will always be one of the solutions in this particular case. So that is something to remember, that if the c value is 0 or if there's no number at the end, you just have the x squared and the x equals 0 will always end up being one of the solutions in this case. Let's just take this a small bit further. So we've already said typical quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. What happens if b is 0? All right. In other words, what happens, as you see here, if you have the x squared and the number, but you don't have the x part in the middle? What happens in that case? Well, as you can see, in that case, you will factorize using the difference of two squares. Let's have a look at a couple of examples here. So let's say I have the quadratic equation x squared minus 16 is equals to 0. So I realize this is a quadratic equation because I have an x squared and an equals sign, but it's not a trinomial. This one I'll factorize using the difference of two squares because we don't have the x part. In other words, our b value is 0. So using our difference of two squares, remember we call it x to be squared minus 4 to be squared is equals to 0. So that gives us x minus 4, x plus 4, using the difference of two squares factorizing rule. And then same again, if this bracket multiplied by this bracket is 0, that means either x minus 4 must be 0, or else x plus 4 must be 0. And then finishing this off, x will equal 4, or else x will equal to minus 4. These are my two solutions in this case. We'll have a look at one more example here. 4x squared minus 25 is equals to 0. So once again, I realize I have the x squared, I have the number, I'm missing the x in the middle, so this is difference of two squares. So I will call this 2x to be squared minus 5 to be squared is equals to 0, and then I factorize it using my difference of two squares technique. 2x minus 5, 2x plus 5 equals 0. And same again, either 2x minus 5 will be 0, or else 2x plus 5 will be 0. In this case, 2x will equal 5. Then dividing both sides by 2, you will get x is equals to 5 over 2. And on the right hand side here, 2x will equal minus 5. And once again, dividing both sides by 2, you will get x is equals to minus 5 over 2. So one thing you might notice about this scenario, when you've got your b equals to 0, where you just have the x squared and the number, your solution will always be the same numerical value but opposite signs. Here I got 4 and I got minus 4. Here I got 5 over 2 and I got minus 5 over 2. So your solutions come in pairs where you have the same value but the opposite sign. So that is how to solve quadratic equations. The best thing for you guys to do is take these sheets and practice these questions. You can check your solutions online. And for access to questions, solutions, graded quizzes and more, visit www.linearmaths.com.